Sometimes, the cruelest punishment isn't losing your fortune. It's discovering you never understood who you were humiliating. Crystal glasses chimed softly beneath the golden lights of Bellamy House, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where politicians, celebrities, and billionaires came to celebrate victories the world would never hear about. At the center table near the panoramic windows, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his tailored charcoal suit, a confident smile playing across his face as he lifted a glass of vintage Bordeaux toward Vanessa Brooks. Her sleek blonde hair shimmered beneath the chandelier, while the diamond bracelet Ethan had bought her only hours earlier sparkled with every graceful movement. Around them, conversations blended into the gentle melody of a grand piano, creating the perfect soundtrack for a man convinced he had finally escaped his old life. To new beginnings, Ethan said with satisfaction. Vanessa smiled, touching her glass against his. And to never looking back. Ethan laughed quietly. Looking back was the last thing he intended to do. 3 months earlier, he had walked away from Claire Whitmore, leaving behind a marriage he described as suffocating, a wife he claimed had become too emotional, too fragile, too ordinary. Her pregnancy had only made everything more complicated. His attorneys were already preparing the final divorce papers. Soon enough, everything would be finished. He had repeated those words so often that he almost believed them. The maitre d' suddenly straightened near the entrance. 2 hostesses exchanged startled glances before quickly smoothing their uniforms. Several waiters instinctively stepped aside. Ethan barely noticed. He was too busy listening as Vanessa described a luxury villa she wanted in Santorini. Then the restaurant doors opened. Cool evening air slipped inside, carrying with it an unexpected silence. Every nearby conversation faded one voice at a time until only the piano remained. Ethan frowned. People were standing, not dramatically, respectfully. Their eyes were fixed toward the entrance. Curious, Ethan turned his head. His fingers froze around the stem of his wine glass. Claire Whitmore stood beneath the soft amber lights, 7 months pregnant, wearing a simple ivory maternity dress beneath an elegant cream coat. She looked nothing like the broken woman he had left behind. Her long golden hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and despite the gentle curve of exhaustion beneath her blue eyes, there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a silver-haired gentleman in a perfectly tailored navy suit, whose calm expression carried the unmistakable authority that money alone could never buy. The restaurant manager hurried forward so quickly he nearly forgot his composure. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," he said, lowering his head with genuine respect. "Your private dining room has been prepared exactly as requested." Ethan felt every drop of color drain from his face. His heartbeat pounded louder than the piano. Jonathan Whitmore, the billionaire CEO whose signature could move markets before breakfast. The man Ethan had spent years trying unsuccessfully to impress. The man Claire had once quietly called her father, a claim Ethan had laughed away as an impossible fantasy. Jonathan gently offered his arm to his pregnant daughter before leading her farther into the dining room. Claire never looked toward Ethan. She didn't need to. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Ethan Caldwell realized the worst mistake he had ever made wasn't bringing his mistress to dinner. It was believing the woman he abandoned had been powerless all along. Stay with me, because the woman everyone in that restaurant mistook for a forgotten wife had spent years carrying a secret worth billions, and she had never once used it to save herself. Claire Whitmore lowered herself carefully into the leather chair that overlooked Central Park. Jonathan waited until she was comfortable before taking his own seat across from her. No words passed between them at first. They didn't need to. The private dining room was wrapped in warm walnut panels, soft candlelight, and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the glittering Manhattan skyline. Outside, the city rushed forward without mercy. Inside, time seemed to pause. A waiter approached with practiced elegance. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I bring you sparkling water?" Claire smiled politely. "Just still water, thank you." The young waiter nodded, but his eyes lingered on Jonathan with unmistakable admiration. Everyone in New York's financial world knew that face. Jonathan Whitmore wasn't simply another billionaire. He was the founder of Whitmore Global Holdings, the man whose investments quietly rescued struggling corporations and whose signature could determine the future of entire industries. Yet Claire had never introduced herself as his daughter. Not once. Across the restaurant, Ethan continued staring, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he believed about his wife. This couldn't be real. Claire had always lived modestly. She drove an ordinary SUV. She wore simple dresses. She volunteered at children's hospitals instead of attending elite galas. During their marriage, she had never asked for expensive jewelry, luxury vacations, or designer handbags. More than once, Ethan had even criticized her for lacking ambition. Now, every memory suddenly felt incomplete. Vanessa noticed his silence. "Ethan," she whispered, placing a manicured hand over his wrist. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. His attention never left Claire. His mind drifted backward to the afternoon they first met 4 years earlier. Rain had soaked the sidewalks outside a neighborhood bookstore. Claire had been kneeling beside an elderly woman whose groceries had scattered across the pavement after a taxi splashed through a puddle. While everyone else hurried away, Claire stayed. She gathered every apple, every loaf of bread, every broken carton of eggs, as though nothing else in the world mattered. Ethan remembered thinking she looked almost unreal. Beautiful without trying. Gentle without weakness. Different from every woman he had dated inside Manhattan's social circles. They married 18 months later in a quiet vineyard ceremony attended by fewer than 40 guests. Ethan had assumed her small guest list meant she came from an ordinary family. Claire never corrected him. When he casually asked why her father wasn't there, she simply smiled and answered, "He's working overseas." It wasn't exactly a lie. Jonathan spent most of that year negotiating acquisitions across Europe and Asia. Claire had protected his privacy because she wanted a marriage built on love instead of influence. She wanted someone to choose Claire Whitmore, not the billionaire's daughter. For nearly 2 years, she believed Ethan had done exactly that. Until the late-night business trips multiplied. Until unfamiliar perfume lingered on his jackets. Until restaurant charges appeared on their joint statements for dinners she had never attended. Even then, she never called her father. She never asked for lawyers. She never demanded revenge. She simply hoped the man she loved would remember the promises he had once made beneath the vineyard lights. Across the room, Ethan swallowed hard as another unsettling realization settled over him. If Claire had hidden something this enormous from the beginning, what else had he never bothered to learn about the woman carrying his unborn child? Some people mistake silence for weakness. They never realize silence is often the final courtesy before the truth arrives. Ethan pushed back his chair so abruptly that the legs scraped across the polished marble floor with a harsh screech. Several nearby diners glanced toward him before quickly pretending they hadn't noticed. Vanessa forced a laugh. "Seriously, Ethan, you're acting like you've seen a ghost." He barely heard her. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched Jonathan Whitmore pull out Claire's chair with quiet care, waiting until his pregnant daughter settled comfortably before taking his own seat. There was nothing theatrical about the gesture. No bodyguards surrounding the table. No loud declarations of wealth. Just a father making sure his daughter was comfortable. Somehow, that simple act unsettled Ethan more than any display of power ever could. "I'll be right back," Ethan muttered. "Where are you going?" Vanessa asked. "To fix a misunderstanding." He crossed the restaurant with measured confidence, forcing his shoulders back even as doubt tightened inside his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. Claire noticed him approaching long before he reached the private dining area. Her blue eyes lifted slowly from the menu, calm and unreadable. There was no anger in them, no tears, no desperate hope that he might return. That frightened Ethan more than if she had screamed. "Claire," he began, offering an awkward smile. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." She answered with quiet politeness. "Neither was I." The words landed softly, yet they carried the weight of a closing door. Ethan cleared his throat. "You never mentioned your father was Jonathan Whitmore." Claire studied him for several long seconds before speaking. "You never asked because you wanted to know me. You only asked because you wanted to measure me." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Jonathan calmly folded his napkin and finally looked up. His gray eyes were steady, neither hostile nor welcoming. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan immediately straightened. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening." Jonathan's voice remained perfectly composed. "I understand you've been taking care of my daughter." Ethan forced another smile. "We've had some difficulties recently, but relationships are complicated." Jonathan simply nodded once. They usually become complicated when honesty leaves the room. Silence settled over the table. Even the nearby waiters instinctively slowed their movements, sensing something important unfolding beneath the polite conversation. Vanessa suddenly appeared beside Ethan, her designer heels clicking sharply across the marble floor. She wrapped one arm possessively around his. "There you are," she said brightly before turning toward Claire with an exaggerated smile. "Claire, what a surprise. I didn't realize this restaurant accepted walk-ins." Claire remained seated. She didn't answer. Vanessa interpreted the silence as surrender. "I suppose congratulations are in order," she continued, glancing at Claire's rounded belly. "Single motherhood isn't easy, but I'm sure you'll figure something out." Ethan closed his eyes for the briefest moment. "Vanessa, too late." Jonathan slowly placed his water glass onto the table. The faint click against the linen sounded strangely loud inside the suddenly silent dining room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't frown. Instead, he looked directly at Vanessa with calm curiosity before asking one simple question. "Young lady, do you always insult people before learning whose table you're standing beside?" The most expensive lessons are rarely taught by enemies. They're taught by the people who once loved you enough to trust you. Vanessa's confident smile faded the instant Jonathan Whitmore asked his quiet question. She glanced around the room, suddenly aware that several executives at nearby tables had stopped eating altogether. No one interrupted. No one dared. I didn't mean anything by it," she replied with a nervous laugh. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. Intent and character are not always the same thing. His words were gentle, almost fatherly, yet they landed with remarkable precision. Vanessa instinctively loosened her grip on Ethan's arm. Ethan quickly stepped forward, desperate to regain control before the evening slipped completely beyond his reach. "Sir, Vanessa doesn't know the full situation." Jonathan's expression never changed. "Neither, it seems, did you." The silence that followed carried Claire back to another quiet evening nearly 3 years earlier. She had been sitting beside her father in his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. Jonathan had just returned from a month-long acquisition tour across Europe. "If you marry him," he had said while pouring 2 cups of tea, "I will respect your decision. But remember one thing." Claire smiled. "You're going to tell me rich men can't always recognize real love." Jonathan had smiled back. "No. I'm going to tell you that money often prevents people from revealing who they really are." Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's exactly why Ethan will never know about our family." Jonathan had studied his daughter for a long moment. "You're willing to hide everything?" "I don't want someone to marry Jonathan Whitmore's daughter. I want someone to love Claire." Her father hadn't argued again. He had only made one request. "If he ever stops protecting your heart, promise you'll let me protect you." Claire remembered laughing softly before answering. "Dad, that day will never come." She had believed every word. Back then, Ethan worked 18-hour days building Caldwell Hospitality into one of Manhattan's fastest-growing luxury restaurant groups. Claire quietly supported him in every possible way. She reviewed business proposals late into the night, organized charity events that improved his company's public image, and even sold the small beach house her late grandmother had left her to provide emergency cash during a difficult expansion. Ethan never knew where that money truly came from. Claire simply told him she had inherited a modest property. She never mentioned that Jonathan had offered to invest $50 million overnight. She wanted Ethan to succeed on his own. She wanted him to believe his victories belonged entirely to him. And for years, Jonathan honored her wishes. He remained invisible, watching from a distance while discreetly opening doors Ethan believed he had unlocked himself. A banker returning calls within minutes. A hesitant investor suddenly agreeing to a meeting. A hotel chain unexpectedly accepting Ethan's proposal. Jonathan had never claimed credit. He only protected the man his daughter loved because seeing Claire happy mattered more than recognition. Now, standing inside Bellamy House, Ethan finally understood the invisible hands that had lifted his career higher than he ever imagined. Every opportunity he proudly called self-made suddenly looked very different. Jonathan looked directly into Ethan's eyes and spoke with heartbreaking calm. "You spent years believing you built your future alone, Mr. Caldwell." He paused just long enough for the words to settle. "What you never realized was that the person you discarded had been the reason so many doors opened in the first place." The moment a lie begins to collapse, it doesn't fall all at once. It breaks apart one uncomfortable truth at a time. Richard Collins' words lingered in the air like an approaching storm. Your relationship with the Whitmore family. Ethan stared at the banker, waiting for him to smile, to admit it was an unfortunate joke. It never happened. Instead, Richard opened the leather portfolio resting on the table and removed a thin folder. Our credit committee completed its annual risk assessment this afternoon, he explained calmly. Normally, I wouldn't discuss confidential matters in a public setting. However, given the circumstances, he glanced respectfully toward Jonathan before continuing. I believe transparency is appropriate. Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. Vanessa looked from one man to another, unable to understand why everyone suddenly seemed to know something she didn't. Richard continued. Approximately 68% of Caldwell Hospitality's expansion capital originates from financial institutions whose investment strategies are directly connected to Whitmore Global Holdings. Vanessa frowned. What does that even mean? Richard answered without hesitation. It means that many of the funds supporting Mr. Caldwell's business growth exist because investors trust the judgment of Mr. Jonathan Whitmore. Ethan immediately shook his head. That's impossible. Jonathan never invested in my company. Jonathan remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the tablecloth. No, he said quietly. I never invested in your company. Ethan exhaled in relief. But Jonathan wasn't finished. I invested in the people willing to believe in you. Silence returned. Richard slowly nodded. When respected institutions see Whitmore Global Holdings entering strategic partnerships, they often increase exposure to related sectors. Mr. Caldwell benefited from that confidence without ever realizing where it originated. Ethan's mind raced through years of meetings that had once seemed miraculous. The venture capital firm that approved funding after months of rejection. The luxury hotel chain that unexpectedly accepted his proposal over larger competitors. The international lender that lowered his interest rates without explanation. One by one, those victories no longer looked accidental. Jonathan looked toward Claire with unmistakable pride before speaking again. Every father hopes the man his daughter marries will succeed. Claire lowered her eyes, saying nothing. When Claire asked me never to interfere, Jonathan continued, I respected her wishes. But respecting her wishes did not mean I stopped watching over her future. Ethan's breathing became shallow. You knew about us the entire time? Jonathan gave a small nod. I knew when your business struggled. I knew when my daughter quietly sold her grandmother's property to help you cover payroll. I knew when she stayed awake reviewing your presentations while you slept. Claire's fingers instinctively rested on her unborn child. She still refused to look at Ethan. Richard carefully closed the portfolio. There is one additional matter. Ethan looked up hopefully, desperate for something that might restore his confidence. The board has postponed final approval of your new financing package until we determine whether your personal decisions present a material risk to your company's long-term stability. For the first time since entering Bellamy House, Ethan realized this evening was no longer about an embarrassing encounter with his estranged wife. It had quietly become a boardroom judgment disguised as dinner, and every person who mattered had already begun reaching the same conclusion. The loudest sound inside a collapsing empire is not an explosion. It's the silence that follows when everyone quietly decides to walk away. Ethan stood motionless, his confidence slipping away with every passing second. Around him, the elegant conversations that had once filled Bellamy House resumed, but they no longer felt the same. People weren't ignoring him. They were observing him. A man who had entered the evening believing he belonged among Manhattan's elite now found himself being measured by standards he had never understood. Vanessa finally broke the silence. Ethan, tell them they're overreacting. Her voice carried more fear than certainty. Ethan looked toward Richard Collins. This financing review, it doesn't mean the project is dead. Richard answered with practiced professionalism. No, Mr. Caldwell. It means confidence must be reevaluated. Before Ethan could respond, another familiar face approached the table. Olivia Grant, chief executive of Sterling Development Group, paused beside Jonathan with a warm smile. Jonathan, Claire. She embraced Claire gently, careful not to disturb her pregnancy. You look wonderful. Claire smiled for the first time that evening. Thank you, Olivia. Ethan's eyes widened. Sterling Development had been negotiating a partnership to build luxury residences adjacent to his newest hotel. Olivia turned toward Ethan politely. "Good evening." "Olivia," Ethan said quickly, relieved to see someone he believed remained firmly on his side. "Perfect timing. Richard seems to think my business relationships suddenly became questionable." Olivia's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "Ethan, business has always been about relationships." He forced a nervous laugh. "Exactly." She shook her head gently. "Not the relationships you sign on paper. The ones that reveal your judgment." Ethan stared at her. "What is that supposed to mean?" Olivia glanced toward Claire before answering. "For years, many of us admired the way you spoke about your wife. We believed your character matched your words." Vanessa slowly stepped backward, suddenly feeling like an outsider in a conversation she had never been invited into. Olivia continued. "When people learned you left your pregnant wife while publicly introducing someone else." She paused. Questions naturally followed. Ethan's face tightened. "My personal life shouldn't affect business." Richard folded his hands. "Sometimes it doesn't." Olivia quietly finished the thought. "But leadership is built on trust. Investors don't only evaluate balance sheets. They evaluate judgment." Jonathan remained silent. He never asked anyone to defend Claire. They simply did, one after another, without being prompted, without being pressured. Ethan finally understood something that terrified him more than losing money. Jonathan hadn't destroyed his reputation. Claire hadn't either. The people around him had simply reached their own conclusions. Vanessa looked desperately at Ethan. "Let's just leave." He didn't move. Across the dining room, two executives who had planned to meet him the following morning quietly nodded to Richard before walking away without saying a word. Their briefcases remained in their hands. Their appointment no longer mattered. Ethan watched them disappear through the restaurant doors. For the first time since building Caldwell Hospitality, he realized that contracts could be replaced, investments could be recovered, and businesses could be rebuilt. But once respect quietly walked out of the room, it almost never came back with it. Justice rarely needs to shout. Once the truth has entered the room, silence does the rest. No one spoke for several long seconds. The crystal chandeliers continued casting warm light across the polished marble floor, yet the atmosphere inside Bellamy House had changed completely. Ethan Caldwell remained standing where everyone could see him, but for the first time in years, he was no longer the center of admiration. He was simply the man everyone was quietly reconsidering. Jonathan Whitmore slowly rose from his chair. Every conversation in the private dining room faded again. Not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned it long before entering the restaurant. He adjusted the sleeve of his navy suit and looked toward Ethan with calm, unwavering eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, his voice measured and composed, "I have no interest in humiliating you." Ethan swallowed hard, but said nothing. "Humiliation," Jonathan continued, "is what happens when a person exposes his own character in front of witnesses." The words settled over the room like a final verdict. Vanessa lowered her eyes, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Jonathan turned toward Claire. His expression softened instantly. "Sweetheart, are you tired?" Claire smiled gently. "A little." He nodded. "Then we've stayed long enough." There was no dramatic confrontation, no threats, no triumphant speech. Jonathan simply reached for Claire's coat and carefully draped it across her shoulders before offering his arm. She accepted it with the quiet trust of a daughter who had known her father's protection her entire life. Ethan instinctively stepped forward. "Claire, please." She stopped. For the first time that evening, she looked directly into his eyes. There was sadness there, but there was no anger left. Somehow, that hurt far more. "I know I made mistakes," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "We can fix this. We still have our family." Claire's hand rested gently on her unborn child. "A family," she answered softly, "cannot survive where respect has already died." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I never wanted this." Claire gave a faint, heartbreaking smile. "Neither did I." She turned to leave. Jonathan paused beside Ethan for only a moment. "You spent years trying to earn my respect through business success." Ethan stared at him silently. Jonathan continued in the same calm voice. "You already had my respect the day my daughter chose you." A painful silence followed. "You lost it the day you stopped choosing her." Jonathan walked away without another word. Claire never looked back. Around the restaurant, Chairs quietly slid across the floor as guests resumed their dinners. Waiters carried fresh plates. Glasses clinked softly once again. Life moved forward as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everyone who had witnessed the evening understood they had just seen something money could never purchase. Ethan remained alone beside the untouched bottle of Bordeaux he had ordered to celebrate a new beginning. Across the table, Vanessa quietly picked up her handbag. She hesitated for only a second before walking toward the exit without saying goodbye. This time, no one stopped her. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell discovered that losing a business deal was nothing compared to watching every person who once believed in him quietly choose a different direction. The greatest victories are never the ones that destroy another person. They are the ones that finally allow you to walk away without carrying their weight anymore. 3 months later, the first snow of December drifted quietly across Manhattan, softening the sharp edges of the city Claire had once believed would always remind her of heartbreak. Instead, it reminded her how completely life could change when she stopped chasing what refused to stay. Inside Whitmore Children's Medical Center, she gently rocked her newborn son, Noah, who slept peacefully against her shoulder. His tiny hand rested around her finger with surprising strength. Jonathan stood nearby, smiling as only a grandfather could. "He has your eyes," he said softly. Claire laughed. "Let's hope he inherits your patience instead." Jonathan smiled. "No, I hope he inherits your heart." Through the nursery window, nurses waved as they passed. Claire had chosen to dedicate part of the Whitmore Foundation to expanding neonatal care across the country. She never announced it publicly. She simply remembered how frightened she had felt during her own pregnancy, often believing she was facing the future alone. Now, she wanted other mothers to feel something she hadn't always felt: hope. Across town, Caldwell Hospitality announced the sale of 3 luxury properties to stabilize mounting debt. Industry analysts described it as a strategic restructuring. Those who had attended Bellamy House that evening understood it was something else entirely. Investors had not abandoned Ethan because Jonathan demanded it. They had simply stopped believing in the judgment of a man willing to discard loyalty so easily. Ethan eventually resigned as chief executive, replaced by a leadership team chosen to rebuild confidence. He rarely appeared in public afterward. Those who occasionally recognized him often remembered the successful entrepreneur he had once been. But those who knew the full story remembered something different. They remembered the night he confused kindness for weakness and dignity for ordinary. Claire never celebrated his downfall. She never gave interviews. She never corrected the newspaper articles that guessed at the reasons behind the Whitmore family's renewed public appearances. She had nothing left to prove. One quiet afternoon, Jonathan and Claire walked through Central Park while Noah slept peacefully inside his stroller. Snowflakes settled gently on the bare branches overhead. "Do you regret hiding our family name?" Jonathan asked. Claire looked down at her son before answering. "No, even after everything." She smiled with peaceful certainty. "If I hadn't hidden it, I would have spent my whole life wondering whether someone loved me or my last name." Jonathan nodded slowly. There was nothing left to say. As they continued walking, dozens of strangers passed without recognizing one of the wealthiest families in America. Claire preferred it that way. She had learned that peace was quieter than revenge, stronger than anger, and infinitely more valuable than pride. Somewhere behind them, the city continued chasing success, fortune, and status. Claire no longer needed to. She already possessed the one thing no amount of money could buy back once it was thrown away: her dignity. And perhaps that was the quiet truth Ethan Caldwell would remember for the rest of his life. Some men lose their fortune and rebuild it. Some lose their reputation and spend years trying to repair it. But the men who lose the trust of a good woman often discover that no fortune on earth is ever large enough to purchase it again.